problem in a nutshell that we face is that the messages coming from government are for the UK to stay in the EU's military schemes that it's been developing over the last year and a half. Now, the problem primarily with these military schemes is that they centralise decision making. They put obligations on the UK that incrementally erode the UK's decision-making autonomy, and they also duplicate NATO. What MPs don't currently realise is that the commitments that the Department for Exiting the EU have put forward, and the Prime Minister has put forward in her Munich speech, for membership of the European Defence Fund and European Defence Industrial Programme, what these commitments do is also commit us to a whole raft of other commitments: policy, financial input, membership and commitment to the EU battle groups, and enhanced association membership of the European Defence Agency, and compliance with European defence policy. So it's the whole range of the developing, growing EU defence advance. They're going somewhere very quickly with their EU Defence Union, which they've started calling it. They're trying to take us with them, and we're just rolling over and letting them do that. It's not good for the UK's future autonomy for us to be handing over aspects of defence policy on the way out, and that's what membership of these structures involve. Nick Clegg describes the prospect of an EU army as a fantasy. The reality is that that is the end goal. It's in the Lisbon Treaty, it's in the agreements that have been signed in the last year and a half, and it's in Juncker's speech where he's looking forward to 2024 and 25, which actually is a concrete path. You know, they don't say EU army, but that's because they know how explosive it is for not just the UK, but other countries within the EU would be dead against it. Not least the generals and admirals in France. They have a history of democratic accountability in their armed forces. They always avoid the term EU army because they know that it's a dangerous term. People across Europe would be totally against it. People feel the need to have accountability in defence and to feel like their vote counts, and their elected representatives are in control. And also their nation state. There is an element of sort of identity and national pride around the armed forces of the UK and also of other armed forces across Europe.
Let me kick off by stating my firm belief that the defence of any country and the means to conduct that defence are essential attributes of sovereignty. Sovereignty cannot be delegated, relegated, or divided. If it is, it's lost. That is the first and most essential factor in understanding why handing control of our national defence to the EU is a catastrophic risk. If we hand over our defence, we risk losing our sovereignty and ceasing to be a country at all. The handover of our defence as part of the May government's negotiations with the EU has not, as Julian said, been properly understood nor properly scrutinised, and it's time it is. Now, if I was being kind, I'd say that this is because other topics such as trade have assumed perhaps greater significance. But that part of the negotiations focus on defence effectively create EU control over our defence and our defence forces in the widest sense, because as Gwydion Prince will later make clear, it includes intelligence and security. During the negotiations, the May government sought to lock Britain into various EU structures created in order to establish control of Europe's defence by the EU Commission. These include the European Defence Fund, the European Defence Agency, and the Permanent Structured Cooperation Mechanism, or PESCO. It's crystal clear in the political declaration. Look at clauses 104 to 106 if you want. And by the way, it's an integral part of the binding law of the withdrawal agreement under Article 184.
My brief is to address the biggest and the least understood threat of all. My distinguished military colleagues General Jonathan and Admiral Roger have displayed for you some of the key evidence and examples on facets of the serious and seriously misunderstood defence and defence industrial threats embodied within the May Treaty via the linked mechanisms of the withdrawal agreement and the political declaration. A toxic treaty described, as you may know, by Martin Howe QC as a political Chernobyl disaster, and we have learned, with telling historical precision that must give them a real frisson of revenge, codenamed Versailles within Mr. Barnier's office. They've shown you how in EU law, which is the governing law for the fast-developing defence union that took off on the twin afterburners of the European Defence Action Plan and the Security and Defence Implementation Plan in November 2016, after the British people instructed their government to leave the EU, and thence through 5 successive EU councils, everything is linked to everything else, the theme of this morning's briefing.
The EU has been extremely clever and cautious about how it progresses its military legislative advance, and it's been going on for more than 10 years. And they've always avoided, as much as they can, saying EU army. That's why it appears as common defence in the Lisbon Treaty. But Federica Mogherini, who's the defence supremo of the EU, but by another name, she's Vice President of the EU Commission, head of the European External Action Service, which is the foreign and military department of the EU, and also head of the European Defence Agency. So wearing a lot of hats, very powerful, you know, as powerful as Mr. Juncker, arguably, in terms of policy development. Had the brazen cheek to claim that all of these agreements that she's leading, and not just her, but all the other EU commissioners, are not militarising the EU. And yet that's what all the agreements say. It is a military legislative advance. They're centralising budgets, they're creating a command structure, they are taking control of EU defence procurement, building of ships, tanks, and everything else, and the funding and the legislative environment for that. Yeah, imagine this scenario where in 6 or 7 years' time, the EU has created its single military, which Mr. Juncker has predicted, and it does some foreign intervention and lives are lost. Who's accountable? It's the EU Commission. And you might wonder then, could there be some kind of backlash against the EU Commission and the whole construct of the EU military, similar to the way that Tony Blair faced a backlash for the intervention in Iraq?
So like a spider's web, to touch one part, say Mrs. May's perverse ambition to keep the EU in the European Defence Fund and the industrial programmes, is to be trapped under the strategic control of the global strategy in the EU's common security and foreign policy, as Jonathan has already said. Partnership, as we might understand it, is not, was not, is not now on offer from the EU, as Monsieur Barnier reminded us all kindly in the Sunday Telegraph only yesterday. Participation of any kind in these structures is structurally prescribed within the EU law to be integration, not cooperation, and this cannot be stressed often enough. Was it sheer ignorance of how the EU structures have been constructed, or are there other motives that allowed Sir Alan Duncan and certain senior civil servants to permit these damaging adhesions to occur? In Sir Alan's case especially, 8 of them at the European Council on the 19th of November 2018, already mentioned. And the documents from that meeting place Duncan in the room when it was agreed that the MPCC should be given the authority of an executive military headquarters with the legal right to command intervention forces after 2020, that CARD, as he also explained in detail, Coordinated Annual Review of Defence, which allows the EU essentially to exert financial leverage on the use of national defence budgets and to increase funding to the EDF, which compels compliance with EU strategic control. All of those things happened with Duncan in the room. All of them placed the EU superior to the UK. And I'll return to this briefly at the end of my remarks. The common trope in politics, both sides, is to describe our relationship with the EU as one with, quote, friends and allies. Ladies and gentlemen, be quite clear. In this matter, they are not.
They seem, in the pro-EU elite at the EU seems to be blind to what the public thinks. And so they're going headlong into this course of action where they're getting control, military control, and also foreign policy control. They're talking about dropping the veto in foreign policy, which includes defence, because it's all wrapped up. And they neglect what the public will think of those outcomes further down the line. But I think if there was an event like that, it would be a slow burn. It would increase resentment against the EU, which I think is already growing, but who knows, it could tip them over. That could be the tipping point where people really resist and they start to realise, crumbs, here is the EU state, it's got its own military, things have gone too far. EU fanatics claim that the EU has created peace or safeguarded peace for 70 years. Well, actually, it was the sacrifice of the Allied countries at the end of the Second World War which created that collective memory of the devastation of the Second World War that guaranteed peace, and the creation of NATO on the back of it, which was the successor to that wartime alliance. It's the umbrella of NATO which has guaranteed the peace and protected the external borders of Europe. Now, look at the only example of the EU trying to intervene in a conflict and to create peace. That was Yugoslavia, and what happened there? It didn't work out. The EU's intervention didn't work, and so it fell to the United Nations and to NATO to sort out the problem. So far from actually guaranteeing peace, the European Union failed to prevent genocide even on its own doorstep.
Would tie our defence and defence industries to the EU's rules and policies for defence and indeed foreign policy, and would do so by legal binding treaty. Thus, under EU law, the ruling jurisdiction would be structurally, politically, diplomatically and financially tied into and subordinated to the defence architecture of an unaccountable body, the EU Commission. And be in no doubt, attachment to any part of the EU's defence integration scheme subordinates the country by EU law to the whole of the EU's global strategy. Unless, post-Brexit, we could explicitly annul these measures, then in simple terms, our soldiers, sailors, airmen and marines, our ships and aircraft, our land forces, and our intelligence architecture could all be directed and controlled, put in harm's way, indeed, by a body which could not be brought to account for its actions. The EU Commission is not elected, British voters cannot change it at the polling booths, and yet the May government has been prepared to hand over the first duty of any government, the defence of its people, territory and vital interests, to them. It has sought to make us, in effect, a voiceless, rule-taking colony of Brussels, and I don't think that's too strong a language to use. If you doubt it, read first the withdrawal agreements clauses that deal with this, 81, 92, 95, 101 to 103, and 104 to 106. And read too the technical note on external relations on the 24th of May 2018. Where, I ask myself, and you, is democracy in this? Where's our place in NATO? Where's our sovereignty as a nation? Now, if you'll forgive me, let me go into a little bit of detail about those structures I mentioned and how they challenge our sovereignty and tie us into the wider EU policies. The first slide that's on the screen there shows the governance of the European Defence Fund, which was given clearance on the 18th of April this year. That will be the central pillar of the EU's structures for defence. Now, it's only allocated at the moment 13 billion euros, but it works by leveraging nations' resources through policy compliance, members having to agree to abide by the EU's rules, and also by making grants to encourage sovereign nations to make changes to their defence budgets that further align them to the centre. And this annotated slide here, which again will be available in the pack, shows how the EU currently runs the European Defence Fund, overriding national authorities. The governance of CARD, the Coordinated Annual Review of Defence, is here, agreed to by Sir Alan Duncan on the 19th of November last year, which strengthens the leverage of the EU over national decision-making. The governance of wider EU defence procurement is shown here, and it links CARD and the European Defence Fund to PESCO, the latter by the use of a premium from the European Defence Fund for joint programmes within the EU, and also to the EU's Capability Development Plan, the CDP, which sets priorities and the Capability Development Mechanism. All of these fall under the Common Security and Defence Policy, CSDP, of the EU, and its participants are bound by the ambit of that policy. The European Defence Fund is therefore not some sort of club. It's a power grab, which affects not only our defence industries, but the armed forces themselves and the intelligence services.
Civil servants have impacted the negotiations in terms of defence is actually quite profound, and we see it very clearly when we're doing our research. The civil servants are saying one thing, and the MPs are saying something completely different. And we have this on record. I'll give you an example. There was a story in the Sun newspaper about a civil servant who was within Ollie Robbins' own team in the Europe unit, the defence expert of the Europe unit, who went to speak at the London School of Economics and addressed a load of diplomats about what the UK was proposing to offer to the EU. Now, this was an academic environment. It was outside of the negotiations, and yet he was talking freely about what Ollie Robbins' team was proposing that the UK would give away. It was the most incredible discovery, and it gave the game away about what civil servants were doing and thinking and planning. Unfortunately, the very planning seems to come from civil servants. In defence, they're able to do this because it's so complicated. And we know from our conversations, because it's quite a small world, this whole world of the UK-EU defence partnership. Very few people are actually involved in it, let alone understand it. So we see some of the people, we occasionally speak to them, the people who are proposing and carrying forward all of these arrangements, these cosy little deals before the actual treaty has been done. We know what they're saying, and we know how little MPs understand about it. Sometimes when you look at the way that policy is constructed, it's difficult to imagine that civil servants sometimes are acting in the interests of the United Kingdom. Now that might be a very difficult thing for people at home, watching the news about the negotiations to perceive. But what we see in defence is a situation where the only viable option is for the UK to retain its status as an autonomous military power within NATO. That's what the British people want. That's what the Brexit vote was all about, partly. What civil servants are proposing is the opposite of that. It's giving powers to the centre, to Brussels, amalgamating decision-making, getting involved in joint pots of cash and joint decisions about how that money is used. It's only the civil servants, unfortunately, at the moment, who understand how all of these structures that they've helped to agree to fit together. And they still haven't explained in really clear terms to MPs how it all works. So, yes, unfortunately, some of the civil servants that we hear and see are saying things that are in complete compliance with the EU. So it's easy for us to imagine that their goals are aligned with the EU rather than an autonomous UK.
If you doubt the linkages between CARD and the EDF and PESCO as part of the Common Security and Defence Policy, this chap doesn't. Everything is linked to everything else. And the EU has given itself multiple levels of influence over defence and security. The Common Security and Defence Policy at the top, the European Defence Agency, the European Development Fund, the Coordinated Annual Review of Defence, the Capability Development Plan, the Capability Development Mechanism, and PESCO. If you have a look at that slide, you can see that these levels of control are shown as pillars, ironically ranged against partnership with NATO and the UN. And together they build the EU's global defence and security policy as put into effect through the European Defence Union. The political declaration on the current exit arrangements contains commitments to the three major parts of the EU defence procurement structure. This slide shows how the political declaration links us in to those pillars that I showed you earlier. Page 196 of the withdrawal agreement, we should note, includes the concept of replacing the Lisbon Treaty and its commitments to the common foreign and security policy, including the common security and defence policy, with a new agreement. If we agree to and join these structures, then the political declaration is the legal glue that ties us in. Under page 4, the parties agree that the UK's participation in defence internal action is, and I quote, subject to the conditions laid out in the corresponding EU instruments, unquote. Committing Britain to the framework of the EU rules means that everything is linked to everything else. Furthermore, the political declaration underscores this whole commitment of the UK to structures of the European Defence Union, because it says that the UK agrees to participate, and I quote, to the extent possible under EU law. And as we can see, that extent is very far-reaching, as it includes the full scope of the common security and defence policy. This is therefore all about how an unaccountable body, as I said earlier, seizes control of the budgets and resources of sovereign member states. Thus, the real power in these structures is not just how much money they are themselves allocated from EU funds, probably as much as 38 billion euros in the next 3-year budget cycle, but how much they can leverage and by what means. It must surely be a matter of serious concern that our civil service just doesn't seem to understand how dangerous these mechanisms are. Perhaps in some cases they are fully aware, perhaps they're committed to them. That in itself is alarming, but far more alarming is the fact that moves towards tying Britain into EU defence have not received any sort of proper scrutiny from elected members of Parliament. This may be the busiest time in Parliament for many a year, but the EU and our future relationship with it is the driving issue of the day, and to ignore or conceal the importance of defence in that relationship cannot pass unchallenged. Here's a letter from someone who saw and read about the defence arrangements and decided to write to their MP. The key point is that the May government have been signing up to what he calls EU defence strategies, while giving the impression that these had nothing to do with the UK. He asks for his MP's perspective, whether she knows about it, whether she agrees, and asking why it's not been discussed. Well, here's the response. A lot of denials. Denying, for example, that an EU army is being created, although mentioning an EU army 7 times. Not the question that was asked. But there are 2 key errors. It says, no such common EU defence powers can be handed over from the UK to the EU without the approval of Parliament and a referendum on the issue. There is no requirement for a referendum on simple issues like an extension of EU power over defence. The Lisbon Treaty tells us that a referendum is only required for the creation of a unified military called common defence. The second error is the claim that national security will remain a national competence. This line is repeated in ministers' replies, such as this one from Lord Howe. The EU Commission's own list of competencies states quite clearly that the EU has power or competence to implement a common foreign and security policy, which includes a common defence policy. Our own MOD's Director General of Strategy, Angus Lapsley, is on record backing this view and saying that, and as I quote, defence is no longer a member state preserve in the EU. Mr. Molinar, one of the advisors to Federica Mogherini, the EU's High Rep on foreign and security issues, stated that, and I quote, "If member states research and develop military equipment together, if we use it together and move it together, and all this is in support of EU instruments, then you can say that we have a defence union." That's a long, long way from retaining national competence in defence. It seems to me that there's a high degree of persistency involved in pushing our country into these measures that's almost relentless and is determined to avoid proper scrutiny at all costs. No veto has ever been used by Britain on the implementation of any of these structures. Even when this was possible, and actually it's not always been possible, as elements of the European Defence Fund were put through on qualified majority voting. This was done because, in spite of being central to the common security and defence policy and the EU's defence architecture, it was dressed up very cleverly as an industrial measure. But it's much more than that. But even when vetoes could have been used, they were not. Mogherini on the 14th of May 2018, for example, was excited and perhaps a little surprised that Britain was not blacking any of the EU's moves, but rather joining them. Let's please be clear. Our elected politicians, unlike the EU Commission, are accountable to the people of this country. It's wrong, therefore, for them to allow what amount to fundamental changes in the sovereignty of our country, in or out of the EU, without such changes being subject to the Scrutiny Reserve Resolution of March 2010, a vitally important element. This resolution clearly states that, and I quote, "The government has given an undertaking that ministers will not agree to draft EU policies or laws that have been deposited in Parliament until the committees of both houses have completed their scrutiny work." That undertaking has clearly been breached, and Parliament has been given no measures of redress for that breach. Its effects are therefore with us. It smells to me, ladies and gentlemen, of a stitch-up of the highest order, stealthy, dangerous, and downright wrong. Well, what can we, you, here today do about that? First, awareness. Ensure that members of Parliament are aware that they have missed the scale of events and the breach of their duties and powers. Secondly, alternatives. My friend and colleague, Professor Gwydion Prince, along with Sir Richard Dearlove and Field Marshal Lord Guthrie, wrote an alternative, a draft treaty between the UK and the EU for defence, security and intelligence cooperation consequent upon our departure from the EU. They published it on the 29th of March this year, and it's founded on cooperation, not integration. And third, action. Please tell everyone you can about what's being done to us and our security. This event is part of that, but lobby your MPs, and if you are an MP, demand proper scrutiny. Lobby the MOD too. As Julian said, the materials on the VFB website in a folder with today's date, but we'll also be putting out the message through social media. With a few questions in Parliament, like that one, we can push the requirement for proper scrutiny. We can also prevent those defence and security measures being once again quietly wrapped into trade or industrial deals, and thus stripping our defence authority and autonomy under the radar, even if we leave on WTO terms. That's enough from me, and I want to hand you over now to the Admiral.
To us, it looks as though some people are doing the dirty on the UK. There are negotiations and policy developments going on away from MPs, away from public scrutiny. That's quite clearly taking place. And the way that the timeline on the future defence treaty is being plotted out lends itself to that scenario as well. We have a situation where the future defence treaty will happen in the implementation period. If it happens in the implementation period, the UK will have Brexited, and so will no longer be an EU member state. So any relationship with the EU will be done as a bilateral one, an international treaty. That means that it will be decided by prerogative powers. Well, that's very convenient to the people who believe in the UK giving away defence policy control, because it means that MPs won't be able to block it, and the British people won't be able to. because it will all have been cooked up in, already. These defence negotiations are very advanced. There have been 7 EU Council agreements, as I say, in the last year and a half. And yet, when MPs ask the question, what is going on in regard to defence, DECSU, unfortunately, and government as a whole, gives a very stunted answer, and that answer says, well, we've only had an hour's worth of debate across the negotiating table between Mr. Davis and Mr. Barnier. Well, that might be true, but so much has happened outside of that, so that's not really an answer. Let's have some clarity, and that hasn't been forthcoming. When we look at the history of the EU, there have been other examples of European EU fanatics, if you like, the people leading the project, trying to put a military dimension on the project. And it goes all the way back to the 1950s. Very soon after the coal and steel community was created, there was an effort to create something called the Pleven Plan. It was designed by a minister, a French minister called Monsieur Pleven, who created this whole scheme that knitted together all of the military departments of the member states into one unit with a central budget, central decision making, and it was going to be a pillar of NATO. So it's going to be quite neatly tied in with existing alliances. What we have now, and it's already been decided, is not just an idea, but it's there on paper and it's now rolling. It's being it's being taken forward in a trial process. Is something called the EU Defence Union, which bears a remarkable resemblance to the Pleven Plan of the 1950s. The only thing that's different is that the description of it being a part of NATO is left out. And today's EU Defence Union says that we assert defence decision-making autonomy from NATO. Well, why on earth would they do that? So it's even less in tune with NATO than the version in the 1950s, which was rejected by the French.
So what are the main benefits of leaving the EU in terms of British defence industry?
Well, there's several. First of all, it's the democratic accountability. We would be retaining parliamentary and UK government control of domestic defence and defence procurement. We'd be operating on our own terms under NATO standards, and we'd maintain the link between the UK government and UK defence industry, which is vital for the survival of that industry. If we go along with what the EU Commission wants, we'd be severing that link, because they want an EU-wide defence industry where they run it, they control the central budget, they control the principal main projects in that industry and do all of the procurement. Thereby we'd lose control on the way out. That's certainly not in keeping with the democratic mandate of the referendum. What we can see happening is that actually the UK's role as a world power would be enhanced if we leave with our defence autonomy intact. That's for several reasons. First of all, the UK would be a check on the power of the EU and Brussels in the context of European defence. We'd be a NATO member, but outside of the EU. Secondly, it allows us to forge alliances autonomously with our old allies. You only need to look at Australia and the new contract for shipbuilding that's come about as part of that desire for a greater bond between the UK and other non-EU countries in the future. And thirdly, there's a really important point that MPs might not know about, which is that the UK would be free to make decisions at the UN Security Council and in foreign affairs, free from EU control. At the moment, we're subject to the decision-making of the European External Action Service, where there's a joint decision-making takes place at EU level. But also, the UK's decisions at the Security Council at the United Nations are controlled effectively by our commitment to the Lisbon Treaty. So most people wouldn't know this, but every decision that the UK makes at the Security Council has to be run past Brussels first, and they have to then give us an opinion on what the UK should do. That's an incredible situation for a democratic country to have to go along with. And so we'd be free from that. That's one of the many opportunities for the UK and for a much more democratic future. Well, we get a gist of what some of the generals and admirals who are serving think. Most of them actually are not fully aware of what UK participation in EU structures means. They know that NATO works. Most of them are not free to talk openly about politics in general, and so they tend not to give us a view about the negotiations in or out or anything like that. Once they've retired, then the vast majority of them are on our side, because having served in the armed forces, and this isn't just the generals, this is every rank that you can name, they've served and therefore they've got an impression of what UK sovereignty is all about, because they've put their lives on the line for it. It means something to them, and therefore the independence of the UK naturally is an important thing. It matters, so they tend to be on our side. So during the referendum there were EU fanatics saying that somehow the voters were being influenced by Russia, that a Leave vote was playing into Putin's hands. What complete nonsense. It's the complete opposite that's true, because by staying in the EU we would be playing Putin's game, because nothing is wrecking Europe more speedily than the European Union, the Eurozone and the EU's efforts to create a duplicating structure in defence that frankly detracts from and undermines NATO. Yeah, in addition to the 350 million a week figure, there were sums of money that the UK spends, including in defence, that are not included in that sum. For instance, the UK hosts the EU NAVFOR in Northwood, which is the naval missions in the Mediterranean and East Africa. It's the UK's competence and capability and history of being able to put together those coalitions that meant that we were able to host that. Well, that hasn't come cheap. You know, that's decades, if not longer, of military capability and investment. So that's not factored in. The UK's contribution to those missions, to foreign affairs, intelligence, all needs to be added into the mix, and that's often quite expensive. When the result came through, I didn't quite believe it, and I remember someone taking me to a TV screen and explaining the numbers, saying, look, it is impossible for them to win, and just staring at the screen thinking, thank goodness it's happened, you know, we've woken up in time. And by then the dawn was breaking, there's a bright blue sky. I walked down past Parliament and I thought, crumbs, this place is now going to be sovereign again. You know, we're going to be making democratic decisions on our own terms. The whole complexion of that scene takes a different tone, knowing that we're not going to be linked in to this supranational imposition anymore. We're not going to be dictated to anymore by these people who've got a different objective for where our country should be going. So I wandered on down to Whitehall, and that was just at the point where there was a crowd gathering at the end of Downing Street to listen to David Cameron making his resignation speech. And an amazing moment, and it felt like this peaceful revolution in a way. You know, walking around the streets of a country that was just in the midst of changing and for the better.
Quite moving for you.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
You're actually emotional just recording, aren't you?
Yeah.
Blimey. Isn't it extraordinary how much it affects us? Because I feel the same. I could almost. You're almost in tears, mate. I'm getting drawn into it as well, because we all feel that deeply about it, don't we?
the central raison d'être of the accelerating drive towards an EU defence union, championed by Frau von der Leyen, who we saw in the opening film clip, and the hard federalists, who are now in the ascendant in the EU institutions, is precisely to exclude and to challenge the United States and to fracture the Anglosphere alliances. Indeed, in his Armistice Day interview at Verdun, President Macron was on local radio, by the way, so not widely heard here. I heard it. President Macron was explicit in identifying the United States as one of the EU's potential future enemies. As the entire EU project lists and founders hold by the self-applied limpet mine of the euro and sinking from widespread lack of popular legitimation, the hard federalists are doubling down in this very area of our concern, in this august building, which the Iron Duke's spirit looking down upon us in this library, in their one last push strategy to try and save their leaky craft, their quasi-religious faith, and perhaps more important for many of them, their perks and their jobs. These, ladies and gentlemen, are not the words of friends and allies. So precisely wherein does the threat to Five Eyes lie? In 8 weeks' time, we will execute a geopolitical pivot of epic importance. Great Britain will revert from the unhappy and always awkward continental commitment of the last 40 years to our natural alignment, which fits our temperament, our interests, and our true alliances, back to the open seas, the Commonwealth at large, and the Anglosphere. It will correct the errors of the 1970s, and once made, I do not expect it to be changed, certainly not in my lifetime. In short, once gone, the EU bureaucracies will never get us back, and they know it. And we will thrive, which they cannot bear. Hence, I suggest, the deliberate, and I underline that, the deliberate preemptive efforts to fracture our relationships within the Five Eyes intelligence alliance, which everybody here, I hope, understands to be the fundamental alliance that keeps the free world free. General Jonathan's already alerted you to the moment when, without parliamentary scrutiny, let alone vote, the May government pivoted from the 60-year norm of UK defence and foreign policy, which has been to frustrate all efforts at EU military union, to craven subjugation, and that was on the 24th of May 2018 in the dryly named Technical Note on External Relations. Now, it is said that the devil is in the detail. And my goodness, ladies and gentlemen, there are a whole pandemonium in this document. In Articles 6 and 14, we find ambitions to share intelligence and analysis. This is the crucial thing, a distinction to be grasped. Of course, we share finished intelligence product on a case-by-case basis with nation-states in Europe. We always have, we gave the French early warning of Bataclan. The fact they didn't act on it was their decision, but we gave it. But that is completely different from sharing structural engagement, as I will explain further. Articles 6 and 14 of that note were confirmed the next day in another technical note on exchange and protection of classified information on the 25th of May, which shows that the May cell placed intelligence sharing with the EU at the very core of its offer to build, I quote, a new, deep and special partnership with the EU, fundamental to cooperation across the future partnership, clauses 1 and 2. Affirming this, a Cabinet Office paper on security on the 28th of November last year finally conceded that it was indeed a structural and institutional relationship in intelligence that was to be created. It states, that paper, quote, the UK and the EU have agreed to conclude an agreement. Although agreements on classified information exist between the EU and non-associated third countries, such as Canada and the United States, the UK's intention, for the reasons that Jonathan explained, to remain in the EU's defence industrial structures and associated policies, which have still not yet been cancelled, would necessitate a CSDP-based agreement. So, The technical notes claim, clauses 11 and 12, for those of you who are nerdy, that Canada and the United States are equivalent precedents on which the UK can build, but potentially go further, to quote its language, is dangerously false. The May government acknowledged that this relationship would be more than ad hoc and governed by the EU's prescribed Security of Information Agreement for this purpose. Political declaration even acknowledges that the UK and EU, quote, should exchange intelligence in support of CSDP missions and operations to which the UK will be contributing. Point there being that the government has committed to stay in those as a precondition to participate in the EU's defence industrial landscape and frameworks, which was such an obsession of the previous government and Prime Minister. The political declaration indicated a UK interest in the EU Satellite Centre and space projects, all of which are components of the EU's military construct, and CSDP and the SDIP agreements of late 2016 made that so. Yet the EU, amusingly, would exclude the UK, which is Europe's principal satellite builder and technology provider by a country mile, from access to Galileo's secure signal without letting us, while letting us pay for the project. The Johnson government has made decisive moves in this area, as in so many others. So I'm hopeful that now that Galileo is en panne, and soon to be down the pan, because the signal ain't working, we will get on with our own national GPS system. Given that, unlike Canada or the United States, the UK would be compelled by the exit deals in any version of the May Treaty, even with lipstick applied to it, to apply the EU's CSDP, since the theme of this morning, ladies and gentlemen, everything is attached to everything else, the EU global strategy will rule. And that document, the global strategy, calls for a hub-and-spoke intelligence arrangement between the EEAS, which is the ersatz Foreign Service, and INTCEN, the intelligence center of the EU, and national intelligence capabilities of CSDP states. And these, and I can't make this point strongly enough, are structural, not ad hoc relationships. And therefore, they threaten the Five Eyes intelligence alliance. That's the bedrock of Western security. Please be under no illusion. Were we, upon leaving the EU on the 31st of October, incongruously, by failing to annul these agreements that have been made since June 2016, were we to allow the EU access either to primary collection, to Five Eyes analysis, or to our sources or methodologies in either of these, we would allow the fracture of our principal security alliance. Francois Fischer, the head of intelligence analysis at the EU Intelligence and Situation Centre, is entirely clear in his ambition, as educated Frenchmen often are, presumably based on arrangements that had been made by the May cell. I quote him, "In intelligence and security, the UK won't leave. Big secret, but you won't leave. It's not yet in the public arena," he shares with us, but there are capacities, mysterious word, that allow the UK to stay in the EU's defence and intelligence network, which are a set of, quote, EEA commitments and administrative arrangements. We will have problems, he opines, practical problems and legal problems, but concludes, happily, in France there is a saying that we are not a limitation service. We are a special service because we do special things and wait for it. Therefore, we don't bother about legal limitations. So the EU will play fast and loose with the help of compliant British officials to put Five Eyes at risk. All these shackles are forged and locked by British officials into clauses 105, 106, and especially 118 of the political declaration, which, as General Johnson reminded you, is via Article 184 of the withdrawal agreement, integral to the whole toxic mess of Mrs. May's treaty. Please don't just take my word for it. Don't even take the word of my research partner in the work that I do, who is Sir Richard Dearlove, the former chief of the Secret Intelligence Service, MI6. We, Richard and I, are not alone in analysing these risks. Ladies and gentlemen, do be aware that our Australian and American allies are fully woke, in the old-fashioned sense of that word, of being awake to this threat. When late last year and earlier this year I briefed on these issues to intelligence community insiders on Capitol Hill and in Washington, there was one occasion after I'd finished when there was a long silence. It was eventually broken by one of the most senior staffers on the Hill, remarking, "Professor, do not mistake our silence for disinterest, the opposite. I think we've all been digesting the enormity of what you have briefed and the extent to which it poses a threat to US national security." Precisely. And ladies and gentlemen, I have little doubt, having studied this pretty intensively now for a couple of years, that these are consciously intended wrecking provisions inscribed by the drafters of these intertwined EU and UK government documents and undertakings. And so finally, before I close, let's just consider why anybody would countenance such a thing. And who are they within the British Civil Service? Well, I would suggest for two linked reasons. In 1519, having landed on the shores of the Gulf of Mexico, Cortés, you may remember, burned his boats. Why? So that his soldiers had no way back to Cuba. For the irreconcilable Remainers, there is no better way to sabotage the people's decision to leave the EU than to destroy preemptively our relationships whence the prodigal is returning. And secondly, and contingently, such conduct speaks of deep institutional capture. It takes us into the realms of psychology and so on, which are not my principal brief. So let me therefore mention three significant officials, all of whom remain in posts in the Cabinet Office and the Ministry of Defence. The youngest is a person called Alistair Brockbank, who was the defence advisor to Ollie Robbins of blessed memory, Mrs. May's former EU chief at Number 10. Brockbank gained notoriety from the publication of the Kit Kat tapes, which you may have heard of. On the 15th of March 2018, the Sun newspaper published explosive extracts from a secret tape recording that had been made of British officials addressing a group of EU officials. First, we hear a British official called Victoria Billing from Dexu chuckle as she describes how British officials go through the motions of making a chocolate coating that superficially conforms to the Brexit mandate, while actually baking a layered biscuit of the sort of integrative agreements that Jonathan has been rehearsing, and which were actually listed in the Dexu Closer Union paper of September 2017.
On our side, on the Trump Police Defence, we're actually looking for something which I normally call a patchwork, but somebody yesterday called a Kit Kat, which I rather like, where you have the kind of cover of you have the kind of political framework cover, but underneath you have a series of different agreements.
And then on the full Kit Kat tapes, that's why they're called the Kit Kat tapes, because she's talking about a Kit Kat bar. On the full tapes, which the Sun allowed me to have, and which I published on our Briefings for Brexit website as an annex to an essay which I wrote called Leaving Hotel California, that you can find there, we hear Alistair Brockbank from the May cell, because he's one of this close coterie of the former Prime Minister, making extraordinary statements. He says, I quote from the tapes, "Where we think things should be, and similarly to what the EU has put out in their guidelines, is that there should be no gap on CFSP or CSDP on exit day. He regrets our absence from PESCO, the main organ of Defence Union, as you have been told, and he says, quote, we would see what we can contribute towards PESCO still as the EU moves it forward. Of the list of acronymic EU defence institutions, the EDF and the EDRP and the EDIDP and so on, he states that, quote, on the capabilities side, we are interested in it all. He wants to remain in CARD, the Coordinated Annual Review, whose mechanism Jonathan described. He even talks about the UK retaining a seat on the UK's negotiating bodies, while aware that only a proximity role might be possible, and he suggests that the ERSAT's European Foreign Ministry, the EEAS, might have people placed inside British government ministries after Brexit. Like Ms. Billing, Mr. Brockbank cynically boasts that it is civil servants who are, I quote, negotiating the detail of that at the same time as we are discussing the political high-level fluffy bits, his words, that will go into any declaration that's made public. In other words, that's wool to be pulled over the people's eyes. He states that the ambition is to lock the UK into and under EU control in the defence, security and intelligence areas by an international treaty as soon as possible after leaving day, which is one of the reasons, by the way, that Sir Richard and Lord Guthrie and I prepared the draft treaty with the help of international lawyers, which is now there tabled and indeed available to Number 10 to roll the day after we leave. It's a protective treaty, as distinct from a destructive and colonial treaty. Ladies and gentlemen, to the best of my knowledge, which is of course limited, that's merely of an outsider, Mr. Brockbank has been neither censured nor sacked by the past and continuing Cabinet Secretary and National Security Advisor, Sir Mark Sedwill. Senior to Brockbank by far are a man already mentioned, Mr. Angus Lapsley, recently honoured in the Queen's Birthday Honours, and Dr. Brian Wells. Both of them are now senior in the Ministry of Defence. Lapsley is on record in 2016 when he was the UK's ambassador to the EU Political and Security Committee, telling his fellow ambassadors on a charming away day in the Alps, which is the sort of thing ambassadors do, because after all it's very hard work and you do need to go to the Alps quite a lot, that he didn't understand why his country had voted to leave the EU. Ich verstehe nicht, he said. Bizarrely, he declared in the same remarks that EU foreign policy had always been relatively popular in the UK, and that we rather like the security strategy, we rather like the global strategy. We were part of the member states who helped to shape it. Yes, indeed, we were. He was, I think, probably one of those involved. We think it's a good strategy. The we is clearly first-person singular. Mr. Lapsley has tweeted subsequently that the EU Commission is needed if we're to respond to modern threats in Europe, and as General Jonathan mentioned when he was mentioning him, he explicitly diverges from the normal view that defence is a sovereign responsibility of sovereign states. He believes that it shouldn't be, and that the EU should run our defence. And this gentleman is now an MOD director in charge of negotiating, still today, as we sit here, just behind us in this building. His fellow co-worker is Dr. Brian Wells, who is in charge of science and technology in the building behind us. Dr. Wells had a long career. He and I coincided once when I too was working in the Defence Research Agency, and he also. Subsequently, he's worked for the EU, he worked for Mogherini and the European Defence Agency, and has repeatedly been, he's on the record, encouraging UK defence companies to engage in the drive towards EU defence union. So, to put it in its mildest, both of these men show strong signs of EU institutional capture. And they're British civil servants, serving British civil servants at a high level. People such as these three, evincing such views, ought, in my modest view, as a matter of priority, at the very least, to be transferred to posts unrelated to the EU, and replaced by civil servants of a more traditional stripe, less willing to declare themselves politically and truculently at odds with the people's instructions, and less likely to acquiesce in the anti-Anglosphere wrecking conduct that is embodied in May's toxic treaty text. It is therefore encouraging to see how far and how vigorously already the brooms have been sweeping in the few short weeks of the incoming government. My wish in pointing to these three key individuals is merely to observe that the task is not yet complete in those areas which are, in fact, as all three of us have said, the most central to the primary duty of a sovereign government. Thank you very much.
This is very urgent. This is a call out to Boris Johnson MP, who is also the Prime Minister of the UK. It has come to light that letters have been received by General Riley and by Admiral Sir Roger Lane Knott that irrespective of the result of Brexit on the 31st of October 2019, Europe will, and I repeat, will take control of all our armed forces and security services from the 1st of November 2019. I say again, from the 1st of November 2019, Europe, Brussels, will take control of our entire military force and security services, including all the budget and all the decision-making processes for who we go to war against from the 1st of November this year, irrespective of the result of Brexit. Now, I have just been passed this information. This is hot off the press. Now, as you're aware, Lord James broached this subject in the House of Lords a couple of weeks ago and it went viral on YouTube and through social media sites. He was heckled, saying that it was a load of bollocks. Well, it's true. It's actually real. And at least one or two Lords have been found to be complicit in this military takeover by Brussels and are thinking, or are perhaps being asked about tendering their resignation from the House of Lords. Now, if Boris Johnson doesn't act now to get us out of EU military unification, he also is complicit in this military and security service takeover. So this is dreadfully important, and you must get this shared out now because time is running out. We've got less than a month, in theory, to actually sort this out and stop it. Now, I've said for a long time, and other people have poo-pooed it, that what is happening with our veterans over in Northern Ireland being prosecuted is equal to or part of EU military unification. And it's now been proven by these letters that if they cut the head off our military, take away our special forces, then we have to then rely on special forces based in Europe. So that means that we're going to be controlled by Brussels, which ultimately is Germany and France. So this time next year, boys and girls, we could easily be at war with Russia. What this also means is that our kids, as soon as they leave school, can go into boy service, conscripted in for 2 years and fully trained. And then when they're 18, they can be shipped off to war straight away, no questions asked. This is a big to-do. This is budget, this is security services, this is our military, this is RAF, Royal Marines, Royal Navy and Army. Everything on the 1st of November is going. So again, this is a call out to Boris Johnson. Please get this shared everywhere to make sure, whilst he's on this Tory conference, he is made aware of it. Because if he doesn't do something about it now, he is fully 100% complicit with it. And it's time then for this country to go into some form of revolution to make sure that it's stopped. This is massively urgent. This isn't bullshit. This is real. The letters are there. And Roger Lane Knott, the Admiral, and General Riley are going straight into Parliament as we speak to fight our corner to make sure that this does not happen. This is extremely important. Please share it. Everybody share it, because this is happening and it's happening now, and we've got less than 30 days to stop it. So I'll repeat again. General Riley and Admiral Roger Lane Knott have found information that backs up Lord James on EU military unification. And irrespective of the result of Brexit on the 31st of October, Brussels will be taking over our military. This could be part of the Brexit deal. This could be, yes, you can have Brexit on the 31st of October, irrespective of deal or no deal, but we want your military and security services, all the budget and everything else that goes with it, the technology, etc., our nukes from the 1st of November.
Please tell us the truth about the European Defence Union. This is by far the biggest issue facing the British public, and they know nothing about it officially. Can we please have a proper account of what it entails? Is it really true that the government has entered into private agreements with the European community, that they will, on completion of Remain, or whatever it is to be, transfer to the European Union in Brussels the entire control of our entire fighting forces, including all their equipment? You may jest, my lords, but it has been done, and you must check it out. It is too important to ignore. We must know the truth of this, and we must have it clear for the whole public to know. I believe it is true, and I think we should be told. I have understanding that it is intended that the oath of every serving member of our forces will be cancelled, and they will be required to undertake a new oath of loyalty to Brussels, and that we have had, in recent months, I understand, a series of people sent from our armed forces to create and install the command and control centres to be used for the control of our troops once we have been ceased to have any control over their use, application or deployment. It goes beyond this. They are to take control of our intelligence services, the whole core of the Five Eyes. They will have MI6 and they will have the Cheltenham Monitoring Centre. And we will be excluded from it under the new arrangements completely and have no access either to its product.